The radio traffic went silent for 4 full seconds before anyone understood what had happened. 4 seconds of dead air over a battlefield that had been screaming with chatter only a moment before, and then the mountain valley below checkpoint Ironwood lit up gold, and every soldier pinned behind a burning troop carrier looked up at the same impossible sight. A single aircraft, low and slow, wings waggling through smoke like it didn't know it was supposed to be obsolete. Somewhere in a command tent 40 kilometers east, a colonel who had spent the morning mocking the airframe now stood frozen with his coffee halfway to his mouth, watching the same feed everyone else was watching and saying nothing at all. 3 hours earlier, that same colonel, a broad-shouldered man named Harlan Briggs, decorated, respected, and entirely too fond of his own certainty, had stood in front of a briefing room full of younger pilots and called the aircraft a museum piece. He said it without malice, the way men say things they've said 100 times before, things that have hardened into fact simply from repetition. The A-10 is a flying relic, he told them. Great for air shows. This is not the war it was built for. A few pilots laughed. One did not. She sat in the back row, arms crossed, a faded patch on her shoulder that read Vesper in stitched black thread, and she said nothing, because she had learned long ago that explaining herself to men like Briggs was a waste of altitude. Major Renata Kessler had flown this exact aircraft through 3 deployments, 2 ceasefires that didn't hold and 1 crash landing in a dust storm that should have killed her and somehow only broke her collarbone. She had a reputation, though not the kind that got you invited to dinner. Pilots called her steady. Commanders called her difficult. Briggs called her to her face once, a relic flying a relic, and then walked away before she could answer, which was in its own way a kind of answer. Nobody in that room could have guessed that within the hour, every one of those laughing pilots would be screaming her call sign into a radio, begging the sky to answer. Because somewhere in the valley below Ironwood, an armored column was about to walk into a kill zone nobody had mapped, and the only aircraft close enough, low enough, slow enough, tough enough to save them was the one Briggs had just called outdated. The story of what happened next would be told 100 different ways by 100 different soldiers who were there, but all of them would agree on one thing: the sky over Ironwood didn't feel like war anymore once she arrived. It felt like judgment. To understand what she was flying into, you have to understand what she had already survived. Renata Kessler had earned the callsign Vesper 11 years earlier, during a night extraction gone wrong over a ridge nobody back home ever learned the name of. Vesper, the evening star, the last light before full dark, the one that stays visible even after everything else fades. A flight instructor had given it to her half as a joke, because she always flew her final approach at dusk, cutting it closer to nightfall than regulations technically allowed. The joke stopped being a joke the night she brought 2 wounded soldiers home through weather that had grounded every other aircraft on the field. After that, nobody laughed at the call sign again. They just used it quietly, the way you use a name you respect. She had grown up the daughter of a crop duster in a flat, windswept stretch of farmland, learning to read wind shear before she learned to parallel park. Her father used to say that flying low and slow wasn't a limitation. It was a skill that anyone could point a jet at the horizon and go fast, but it took a real pilot to hang an aircraft in the air at treetop height and put a payload exactly where it needed to go, again and again, without flinching. She carried that lesson into the military the way other pilots carried ambition. It made her extraordinary at exactly the kind of flying nobody glamorized anymore. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was not fast. It was not stealthy. It did not appear on recruiting posters or fighter pilot movies. It was a flying cannon with wings bolted on as an afterthought, built in an era when the Air Force still believed that saving the soldier on the ground mattered more than looking impressive doing it. Younger pilots trained on sleek multi-role jets treated the airframe the way teenagers treat their grandfather's truck: useful in theory, embarrassing in practice. Briggs was far from the only one who felt that way. He was simply the loudest. But statistics didn't care about embarrassment. In every engagement where infantry had been danger close to enemy armor, where visibility was low and timing was everything, it was aircraft like Vespers that soldiers actually prayed for. Fast jets could deliver a strike. Only the A-10 could loiter above a firefight for an hour, absorb ground fire that would cripple anything else, and put 30mm rounds through the roof of a tank with the same patience a surgeon brings to an incision. The soldiers on the ground knew this. The officers writing procurement memos increasingly did not. That gap between what commanders believed on paper and what soldiers believed while bleeding in the dirt was about to collapse in on itself at checkpoint Ironwood, and Renata Kessler would be standing in the middle of it when it happened. The mission brief that morning had sounded routine, which in hindsight should have worried everyone. A mechanized column call sign Wolfhound was moving through the Ironwood corridor to reinforce a forward operating base that had been quietly losing ground for a week. Intelligence estimated light resistance, scattered technicals, maybe a few dug-in mortar positions, nothing the column's own armor couldn't handle. Vesper had been assigned as backup air cover, a formality, a box to check. Briggs himself had signed off on the tasking with the kind of indifference reserved for missions he didn't expect to matter. She pre-flighted her aircraft anyway with the same discipline she brought to every mission, mattering or not. Ground crew called her aircraft Widowmaker on the nose art, though she never called it that herself. She just ran her palm along the leading edge of the wing the way some pilots touch a rosary, and climbed into a cockpit that smelled like hydraulic fluid and 2 decades of other people's fear. Her crew chief, a sergeant named Osai who had kept this particular airframe flying through 3 deployments, handed her the checklist with the same dry joke he made every time. "Try not to bring her back with more holes than she left with, Major." She always answered the same way. No promises. The takeoff was unremarkable. The climb was unremarkable. For the first 40 minutes, the entire mission was so unremarkable that her wingman, a younger captain flying support in a second Warthog, filled the silence with complaints about the coffee back at base. Vesper let him talk. She had learned that pilots who talked too much before a mission were usually the ones trying to outrun a feeling they didn't want to name, and she preferred to let the sky do the talking instead. Below them, the terrain rolled out in long amber ridgelines, dry riverbeds cutting through like old scars, and somewhere beneath all that stillness, Wolfhound's column was grinding forward at 20 kilometers an hour, utterly unaware that the ground itself had already been rigged against them. The first sign that the intelligence had been wrong came not as a radio call, but as a flash of white light on the northern ridge, small and sharp, the kind of signature that meant someone down there had a lot more firepower than a scattered technical. Vesper's threat receiver chirped once, a soft electronic warning that most pilots barely register anymore because it happens so often it stops meaning anything, except this time it didn't stop. It kept chirping, faster, insistent, painting a picture of a battlefield far larger and far better prepared than anyone in that morning's briefing room had imagined. She keyed her mic before conscious thought even finished forming the sentence. "Wolfhound, Vesper 11, be advised, I'm reading multiple emitters North Ridge. This doesn't look like light resistance anymore." The response that came back was not reassuring. It was the sound of a young sergeant's voice cracking under gunfire that had not existed 30 seconds earlier. "Vesper Wolfhound 6, we are taking fire, I say again, we are taking heavy fire, lead vehicle is disabled, we have men in the open." The transmission cut off in a burst of static that sounded less like radio interference and more like the world tearing at the seams. Below her, the amber ridgelines that had looked so peaceful an hour earlier now revealed themselves for what they truly were. A horseshoe of entrenched positions, dug in with a patience that spoke of weeks of preparation, not days. Someone had known Wolfhound's route long before Wolfhound did. Someone had built a trap and simply waited for the column to walk into the jaws of it. Vesper rolled her aircraft into a shallow dive, eyes already sweeping the terrain in the practice grid pattern that 20 years of low-altitude flying had burned into her instincts, cataloging threats faster than her conscious mind could name them. 2 technicals on the eastern flank moving. A heavier signature, possibly armor, dug into a revetment on the north ridge, exactly where her threat receiver had first lit up. And scattered across the open ground below, small dark shapes that her mind refused, for one merciful second, to identify as soldiers, because identifying them meant admitting how exposed they were. "Wolfhound 6, Vesper 11, I have eyes on your position. I see your lead vehicle burning. I see infantry in the open on your 12. She kept her voice level, flat, the tone she had trained herself into over a decade of moments exactly like this one, not because she felt calm, but because the soldiers on the other end of that radio needed to hear calm more than they needed to hear the truth of what she was seeing. "Danger close is authorized on my mark. I need you to get your people behind cover and stay there." Her wingman's voice cut in, tighter than before. "Vesper, I'm not reading a clear target picture. This ridge is lousy with foliage. I don't have a solution." "I do," she said, and there was something in those 2 words, not bravado, not confidence exactly, but the specific certainty of a pilot who had flown this kind of terrain 1,000 times before satellites and sensors existed to do it for her. She had grown up reading wind through wheat fields from a crop duster's cockpit at 50 feet off the ground. This ridge, with its false stillness and its hidden angles, was just another field lying to her, and she had spent her whole life learning how fields lied. She pushed the throttle forward and dropped the nose, and the aircraft that Colonel Briggs had called a museum piece 4 hours earlier began its first pass toward the ridge, engines howling low across a battlefield that was about to learn exactly what it had woken up. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted beneath her cockpit was, in raw physical terms, absurd, a 7-barrel rotary weapon so large that engineers joked the aircraft had been built around the gun rather than the other way around. When it fired, the entire airframe shuddered with a sound that didn't so much announce itself as replace every other sound in the world for the half-second it lasted, a deep tearing roar that soldiers who had heard it in combat sometimes described, years later, as the closest thing to physical prayer being answered. She lined up on the revetment, held her altitude lower than doctrine strictly recommended, and let the gun speak. The line of impacts walked up the ridge like something inevitable, chewing through camouflage netting and packed earth in a heartbeat, and the return fire that had been threading toward Wolfhound's column faltered, stuttered, went briefly quiet. On the ground, Sergeant Osai's voice would later describe watching the feed from a relay drone back at base. Though he wasn't there yet, wouldn't hear about it until after. But the soldiers of Wolfhound who were there felt it directly, felt the incoming round simply stop, felt the strange vertigo of a battlefield that had been screaming at them 1 second and gone eerily quiet the next. Splash, direct hit on the north emplacement, Vesper called, already pulling up and banking hard, scanning for the next threat before the first had finished settling. Wolfhound, I need a sitrep, how many wounded, how many still mobile? The answer came back ragged but coherent, which was itself a kind of relief. Vesper, Wolfhound 6, we have 3 wounded, 1 critical, we are consolidating at the wadi south of the lead vehicle. Eastern flank is still hot, technicals maneuvering, request immediate suppression. She had already seen them, 2 vehicles, fast and low, cutting through a dry riverbed toward the column's exposed flank, the kind of maneuver that worked beautifully against infantry with no air cover and failed spectacularly against pilots who understood terrain. She rolled the aircraft again, feeling the particular resistance of an airframe built not for grace but for punishment, an aircraft that could absorb small arms fire that would down almost anything else in the inventory and simply keep flying, because somewhere in a design office decades ago, engineers had decided that the pilot's survival mattered more than elegance. Her wingman fell into formation behind her, finally finding his rhythm, his earlier uncertainty burning off like morning fog. Vesper, I've got the trail vehicle, you take lead. Copy, on my mark. She dropped altitude again, close enough now that she could see individual figures scrambling from the technicals, close enough that this stopped being tactics on a screen and became something rawer, heavier, the thing every pilot in this seat eventually has to make peace with in their own private way. She made her peace the way she always did, by remembering exactly whose lives were on the other side of the decision she was about to make and choosing them. Back at the operations center, the mood had shifted from routine to something closer to held breath. What had started as a low-priority tasking on a whiteboard was now the only feed anyone in the building was watching, relayed through a surveillance drone loitering high above the valley, its grainy overhead view showing 2 aircraft carving slow, deliberate arcs over a battlefield that kept revealing new and worse surprises the longer it burned. Colonel Briggs stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, saying nothing, which for a man who rarely stopped talking was its own kind of confession. A young operations officer, headset pressed hard against one ear, called out numbers that made the room go quieter with each update. Wolfhound reporting 3 technicals destroyed, 1 troop concentration suppressed on the North Ridge, that's Vesper 1-1 and 1-2, splash on both eastern vehicles. A pause, the officer listening harder. Wolfhound 6 says, another pause, and when he spoke again there was something almost reverent in his voice. Wolfhound 6 says without air support they'd have lost the entire lead element in the first 3 minutes. Nobody in the room looked at Briggs. That too was its own kind of statement. In the air, the fight had not slowed, only shifted shape. The dug-in position on the North Ridge, battered but not destroyed, had gone quiet in the specific way that experienced pilots learn to distrust, not defeated, just reorganizing, waiting for an opening. Vesper had seen this pattern before in another valley another year, and the memory surfaced now not as distraction but as data, the way old scars sometimes ache before a storm arrives. Wolfhound 6, Vesper 1-1, that north position isn't finished. I need your wounded moved, and I need it now. They're going to try to mass fire again once they think we're distracted. Copy, Vesper working on it. We've got a medevac request in, but ETA is 20 mics minimum. 20 minutes, she did the arithmetic instantly, the way she'd done it 100 times before in 100 different cockpits. Fuel remaining, ammunition remaining, the slow mathematics of how long a single aircraft and its wingman could hold a battlefield together through sheer persistence while help crawled toward them from somewhere too far away. 20 minutes was an eternity for a critically wounded soldier bleeding out in a wadi. It was nothing at all for the amount of damage that entrenched position could still do if given the chance to reorganize. Then we hold the sky over you for 20 minutes, she said, and there was no bravado in it, only the plain arithmetic of a promise being made. Nobody touches your position while I'm still flying. She settled into the holding pattern that pilots privately call the loiter, a slow, patient oval carved into the air above the column, the kind of flying that fast jet pilots dismissed as unglamorous precisely because it demanded a different kind of courage than the one they trained for. It was not the courage of a single dramatic pass. It was the courage of staying, of circling back again and again into airspace that had already tried to kill you once, of trading the safety of altitude and speed for the ability to be there, exactly there, the instant the ground below needed you. Her wingman took the outer arc of the pattern, watching the eastern approaches, while she held the inner loop closer to the wadi where wolfhounds wounded were being dragged to whatever cover the terrain offered. Every 90 seconds she called down a status check, not because procedure demanded it, but because she understood something that seemed to elude officers who had never held that radio in a moment like this, that the sound of a steady, familiar voice mattered to frightened soldiers almost as much as the ordnance overhead. Fear fed on silence. She refused to give it any. Wolfhound Vesper still with you. North Ridge remains quiet. Keep working your casualties. Vesper Wolfhound 6 copy. Appreciate you. A pause, then quieter, almost embarrassed to admit it over an open channel. Didn't expect you people to still be flying these things. It was such an ordinary thing to say, born of exhaustion and adrenaline rather than malice, an echo of the same casual dismissal she'd heard from Briggs that morning, except this time it arrived wrapped in gratitude instead of contempt, and something about the contrast made her almost smile inside a cockpit that had no room for smiling. Neither did my colonel, she said, and left it at that because there wasn't time for more, and because the ridge had just begun moving again. The threat receiver chirped, then chirped again, a new signature rising from a position slightly west of the first, better concealed, patient in a way that told her whoever was directing this ambush had learned from the first exchange and adjusted. It was a sobering realization that somewhere down there, an enemy commander was doing exactly what she was doing, reading terrain, reading patterns, refusing to be predictable. And for a moment the fight stopped feeling like a rescue mission and started feeling like something closer to a duel, two patient minds testing each other across an unbridgeable gap of intention. New contact west of previous position, hardened, possible armor, she called, banking toward it, feeling the aircraft respond with the particular sluggish honesty of a machine that had never pretended to be anything faster than it was. Wingman, stay high, cover the wadi, this one's mine. She was no longer flying a mission that anyone back at operations had planned for. She was flying the mission the battlefield had actually turned into, and the only person who seemed to fully understand the difference was the pilot everyone had spent the morning underestimating. The hardened position revealed itself slowly, the way real threats always do, refusing the clean geometry of a training exercise. What at first looked like a single emplacement turned out to be two, staggered along a shallow draw and camouflaged with a discipline that spoke of real training rather than improvisation. She circled wide deliberately, letting them believe for a few seconds longer that she hadn't seen the second position, buying herself the angle she needed. Her father used to say that a crop duster who couldn't read a field before the field read him didn't last a season. She had never stopped applying that lesson, no matter how much the aircraft under her had changed. Wolfhound Vesper, I have two hardened positions, danger close to your casualty collection point. I need exact coordinates on your people before I commit. The response came back precise, the panic of earlier transmissions replaced now by the focused calm of soldiers who had found, in the last quarter hour, something to hold onto. Wolfhound 6 read off grid coordinates with the flat clarity of a man who understood exactly how much depended on getting them right, and she read them back once, matched them against her own targeting picture, and felt the particular cold clarity that always arrived in these moments. Not fearlessness, never that, but a narrowing of the world down to exactly the actions required and nothing else. She rolled in low, lower than doctrine wanted, low enough that the ground fire rising to meet her stopped being an abstraction on a threat display and became a physical sensation, rounds cracking past the canopy close enough that she felt them more than heard them over the engine noise. The aircraft shuddered once, twice, a hit somewhere aft that made her instruments flicker and then steady, and she understood in that instant exactly why this airframe had been built the way it had. Layered in titanium around the cockpit like an ancient armored knight built specifically to survive blows that would kill anything more elegant. She had heard veteran maintainers call the cockpit a bathtub, and she had never loved a piece of ugly, unglamorous engineering more than she did in that half-second. The gun spoke again, longer this burst, walking fire across both positions in a single continuous pass, and this time the silence that followed felt different, not tactical, not temporary, but final. On the ground, Wolfhound soldiers watched smoke rise from the draw and felt something loosen in their chests that had been wound tight since the first shot of the ambush. Somewhere behind her, her wingman's voice cracked with something that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite relief, but sat somewhere adjacent to both. Vesper, that's a confirmed kill on both positions. North Ridge is silent, east flank is silent. I think He hesitated, as if not quite trusting the words. I think that's it. I think we broke it. She didn't answer right away. She was still scanning, still circling, because the sky had taught her a long time ago that the moment you believe a fight is over is exactly the moment it finds a way to prove you wrong. The medevac helicopters arrived 11 minutes later, cutting low across the valley in a formation that soldiers on the ground greeted with the kind of relief usually reserved for things they'd stopped believing would actually come. Vesper held high cover as they descended, watching the wadi below transform from a scene of chaos into something almost orderly, stretcher teams moving with practiced urgency. The critical casualty loaded first, the column's medic riding alongside with a hand pressed against a wound that would have been fatal without the extra minutes her aircraft had bought him. Vesper 11 Wolfhound 6, casualties are loading, thank you. A pause, longer this time, the kind of pause that carries weight a radio transmission usually can't hold. We'd have lost the whole lead element without you up there, all of us know that. Copy, Wolfhound, get your people home. She kept her voice even, professional, because that was the discipline the job demanded, but something in her chest had loosened too, the particular ache of adrenaline finally beginning to recede, leaving behind the bone-deep tiredness that always followed these missions no matter how many times she flew them. Her wingman's voice came through, quieter now, almost hesitant. Major, that gun run on the second position, I've never seen anyone hold that low that long. I thought we were losing you. You don't lose this airframe that easy, she said, and there was something in the phrase that felt less like a boast and more like an old truth finally being spoken aloud after years of nobody wanting to hear it. That's the whole point of her. Back at the operations center, the room had shifted into something that resembled quiet celebration, though nobody quite knew how to celebrate a mission that had so nearly gone catastrophically wrong. The young operations officer who'd been calling out updates all morning finally set down his headset and exhaled, the particular exhale of someone who had been holding tension in his shoulders for the better part of an hour without realizing it. Wolfhound reports 0 further casualties, he said. 1 critical, stable for transport. They're calling it a save. Briggs had not moved from his position near the back wall the entire time, arms still crossed, jaw set in a way that suggested he was working through something internally that he wasn't ready to say out loud. When he finally spoke, it was not to the room. It was to himself, quiet enough that only the officer nearest him actually heard it. A relic, he said, and it wasn't clear if he was mocking his own earlier words or simply repeating them to feel their weight now that the morning had made them ridiculous. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. The feed on the main screen still showed 2 aircraft circling patiently above a valley that 3 hours ago had been on the verge of swallowing an entire column whole, and the silence in the room said everything that needed saying. High above the valley, unaware of any of this, Vesper checked her fuel gauge, calculated her margin, and began the long, unhurried turn back toward home. The flight back was quieter than the flight out had been, in the way that always followed missions like this one, not the silence of nothing to say, but the silence of too much having already been said by the engines, the radio, the gun, the whole terrible chorus of the last 2 hours. Her wingman had gone quiet too, flying tight formation off her wing without the small talk that had filled the earlier leg, and she understood without needing to ask that he was doing the same thing she was doing, replaying the last pass over and over, checking it against every possible version where it had gone differently. She thought, unbidden, of her father, of the summer she'd turned 16 and flown her first real crop run alone, banking low over a field of wheat with her heart hammering against her ribs, terrified of the power lines she couldn't quite judge the distance to yet. He had been waiting at the edge of the field when she landed, not smiling exactly, just watching her climb down with an expression she hadn't understood until years later, the specific pride of a parent watching a child do something dangerous well. He had died before she ever flew in combat, before he ever knew what she'd become, but she carried a version of that expression with her into every cockpit anyway, borrowed from memory, worn like a second set of eyes checking her work. Base runway appeared on the horizon as a thin gray line cutting through the afternoon haze, and she brought the aircraft down through her final approach with the same unhurried precision that had earned her the call sign more than a decade earlier. The last light before dark, steady when everything else had already given up for the day. The wheels touched down, and the particular controlled violence of an A-10 landing shuddered through the airframe one final time, before settling into the ordinary rumble of taxiing home. Ground crew were waiting at the hardstand in a way that told her, before she'd even popped the canopy, that word of what had happened over Ironwood had already outpaced her return. Sergeant Osai was among them, arms crossed in a posture that mirrored Briggs's from that morning but meant something entirely different, his eyes moving across the aircraft's skin, counting damage, cataloging the story written in dents and scorch marks, and one ragged tear near the tail that made his jaw tighten before he caught himself and softened it back into something professional. 3 hits, he said, running a hand along the tear the way she had run her palm along the wing before takeoff, an echo of the same small ritual. She's earned a long look in maintenance tonight. She earned more than that, Vesper said, pulling off her helmet, feeling the cool outside air hit sweat-damp hair for the first time in hours. She earned the truth being told about her for once. Osei didn't answer right away. He just looked at the aircraft, then at her, and something passed between them that didn't need words, the particular understanding of people who had spent years defending something the rest of the world had already decided wasn't worth defending, and who had just watched it prove, definitively, that they'd been right all along. Word of what had happened over Ironwood moved through the base the way it always did after missions like this one, not through official channels, which would take days to catch up with paperwork and after-action reviews, but through the informal network of maintainers and loadmasters and junior officers who had watched the drone feed live and couldn't stop talking about it. By the time Vesper walked into the debrief room that evening, still smelling faintly of jet fuel and adrenaline sweat, she found it fuller than she expected. Pilots who had no official reason to be there finding excuses to linger near the back, listening. The captain who'd flown her wing gave his account first, and she noticed something in the way he told it, a kind of reverence he hadn't shown that morning, when the mission had still been an abstraction, a box on a whiteboard. He described the low pass over the second position in more detail than the mission actually required, dwelling on the moment the aircraft had shuddered under fire and kept flying anyway, and she understood that he wasn't really talking to the room. He was talking to himself, trying to make sense of something that had changed his understanding of what this airframe and its pilot were actually capable of. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it clinical, the way she always did: targets identified, ordnance expended, casualties prevented, no embellishment, no drama, because the mission spoke for itself and she had never seen the point in narrating her own courage for an audience. But she noticed, partway through, that Colonel Briggs had entered the room and taken a seat near the door, not at the head of the table where his rank usually placed him, but off to the side, listening the way a man listens when he's no longer certain he already knows the answer. He didn't say anything during the debrief. He didn't say anything after it either, not directly to her, though she caught him watching her pack up her notes with an expression she couldn't quite read, not quite apology, not quite respect, something unsettled in between, the look of a man whose certainties had been rearranged faster than his pride knew how to process. It was Osei who told her later, over lukewarm coffee in the maintenance hangar, that Briggs had spent 20 minutes after the debrief standing alone in front of the mission board, staring at the marked positions on the map without saying a word to anyone. "Man's probably rewriting his whole philosophy up there," Osei said, not unkindly. "Give him time. Pride's slow to turn, but it does turn eventually if you keep giving it a reason to." She wasn't sure she believed him. She had met enough men like Briggs to know that pride sometimes calcified rather than softened, that some people would rather defend a wrong opinion forever than admit a woman flying an unfashionable airframe had proven them spectacularly incorrect in front of an entire operations center. But she also understood, in a way she rarely let herself articulate out loud, that she hadn't flown that mission to change his mind. She had flown it because Wolfhound's soldiers needed someone in the sky who wouldn't quit on them, and that reason had never required his approval to matter. 2 days later, the request came in from a different unit entirely, a mechanized infantry company preparing to push through a corridor 40 kilometers south of Ironwood, an operation that had originally been assigned fast jet cover as a matter of routine, the same way Wolfhounds had been assigned Vesper's squadron almost as an afterthought. This time, the request specified her by name. Not by aircraft type, not by squadron designation, but by call sign, typed into the tasking order by a company commander who had heard the story secondhand and decided he didn't want to take any chances with his own soldiers' lives. It was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of everything shifting. Within a week, 3 more units had made the same specific request, bypassing the usual assignment process to ask for her by name, and the operations staff, the same staff who had treated the tasking as a formality 2 weeks earlier, began scheduling around her availability rather than the other way around. Nobody made an announcement about it. Nobody needed to. The shift showed up in schedules and radio logs and the particular way junior officers started greeting her in the hallway, with something that had replaced the polite indifference of before with an attentiveness that bordered on deference. She found the whole transformation faintly absurd, in the way she found most institutional recognition absurd. The same qualities that had made her competent for over a decade were the qualities nobody had bothered to notice until they became useful in a single dramatic afternoon. She had flown 100 missions with the same discipline, the same low-altitude precision, the same willingness to hold a position under fire longer than regulations comfortably allowed, and none of those missions had earned her more than the standard debrief and a night's sleep. It had taken Wolfhound nearly dying for anyone to finally see what had been true about her the entire time. She mentioned this once carefully to Osai, who had known her longer than almost anyone else on base and had earned the right to hear her complicated feelings without judgment. He listened, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades, and then said something that stayed with her longer than she expected it to. "Nobody notices the load-bearing wall," he said, "until the house starts falling down around it. Don't let it sour you on being the wall. Somebody's got to hold the thing up, and most people never will, whether they get noticed for it or not." She turned that phrase over in her mind for days afterward on every subsequent mission, in every quiet moment between takeoff and contact, and found that it fit her better than any medal or mention in a report ever could. She had spent her whole career being the wall. Ironwood had simply been the day the house had shaken hard enough for everyone else to finally look up and see it holding. The second real test of that shift came 3 weeks later, in a different valley entirely, one with a name most maps didn't bother printing because nothing of strategic value had ever happened there before. That changed the moment intelligence identified a convoy of high-value targets moving through the corridor under cover of a sandstorm that had grounded every fast jet in the theater. Visibility had dropped to a few hundred meters at ground level, the kind of weather that turned modern precision warfare back into something closer to its oldest, most primitive form, pilots flying by instinct and terrain memory, because their instruments couldn't be trusted to see what their eyes still could, barely. Every other airframe on the tasking board that morning had been scrubbed. The fast jets couldn't safely operate in that visibility at the altitudes required for their sensors to function. The situation on paper called for the mission to be scrubbed entirely, the convoy allowed to pass, the opportunity lost to weather the way opportunities so often were in this kind of war. But the operations officer running the board that morning, the same young officer who had called out Wolfhound's updates weeks earlier, looked at the tasking, looked at the weather, and made a call that surprised even himself. "Get me Vesper," he said. "If anyone can fly this soup, it's her." She took the call in the ready room, half a sandwich still in her hand, and listened to the mission parameters with the particular stillness she brought to decisions that mattered. Low visibility, high-value target, no fast jet support possible. A window that would close within the hour as the storm's leading edge pushed the convoy out of the corridor and into terrain where tracking them again would take days they didn't have. It was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of mission that should have been refused. "I can fly it," she said, setting the sandwich down, "but I fly it my way, low, slow, visual. No fancy solutions in this weather, just the terrain and the gun." The officer didn't argue. Nobody argued with her anymore, not about tactics, not after Ironwood, and there was something almost startling about how quickly that particular current had reversed, from a woman who had spent years having her judgment second-guessed by men with less experience and more confidence, to a pilot whose word on matters like this had simply become the final word, unquestioned, because the alternative had already been proven catastrophically wrong once. She briefed her wingman in 4 sentences, checked her aircraft with Osai in 6 minutes flat, and took off into weather that reduced the entire world beyond her canopy to a churning wall of amber dust, flying not by what she could see but by what 20 years of low-altitude instinct told her had to be there, waiting, exactly where the map said it would be. It was, everyone would later agree, the single most dangerous flight of her career. It was also, in its own quiet way, the mission that finally erased any lingering doubt about what she was capable of, not because it was dramatic, though it was, but because she flew it the same way she flew everything, without needing anyone's permission to be as good as she already knew she was. The storm swallowed her aircraft almost immediately after takeoff, and for the first 11 minutes she flew by a combination of instrument crosschecks and something harder to name, a felt sense of the terrain beneath her built from years of memorizing how ridgelines and riverbeds moved past a low-flying cockpit at different speeds and angles. Her wingman, flying tight formation off her right wing because visual contact was the only contact that mattered in weather like this, kept his transmissions to the minimum, trusting her lead in a way that would have been unthinkable to him 3 weeks earlier. "Vesper, I've lost visual on the terrain. I'm flying your wing blind here." "Copy, match my altitude, match my heading, don't think, just follow." She kept her voice as steady as she had over Ironwood, though the honest truth was that flying through the storm demanded a different kind of nerve entirely, not the nerve of absorbing enemy fire, but the nerve of trusting instruments and instinct over the primal animal fear of flying into a wall of nothing at treetop height, where a single miscalculation meant impact rather than survival. The convoy appeared out of the dust with almost no warning, vehicles moving in a loose column along the valley floor, headlights cutting weak cones through the amber haze, entirely unaware that anything could be flying above them in weather this severe. She had perhaps 4 seconds of clean visual before the storm would swallow the picture again, and she used every one of them, reading the column's formation, identifying the lead and trail vehicles, committing the entire scene to memory the way a photograph burns itself into the mind of someone who knows they'll only get one look. Tally lead vehicle and 2 trailing engaging. She rolled in through visibility that gave her barely a heartbeat of aiming solution, relying on muscle memory built across 2 decades of exactly this kind of low-altitude precision work, and the cannon fired in a burst that felt, in that storm-choked silence, like the loudest sound that had ever existed. The lead vehicle came apart in a flash that briefly outshone the dust itself, and she was already climbing, already banking away, before the trailing vehicles had time to register what had happened to the one in front of them. Her wingman's voice, when it came, carried something that sounded almost like disbelief. "Vesper, I don't know how you saw that. I didn't see a thing until you fired." "You don't fly this weather with your eyes," she said, leveling out, already scanning for the convoy's remaining vehicles through gaps in the storm that opened and closed like breathing. "You fly it with everything else you've got." By the time the mission was complete, the convoy neutralized, the target confirmed through a combination of her own account and a satellite pass that finally cut through the weather 20 minutes later, the operations center back at base had gone from cautious hope to something approaching astonishment. Nobody used the word relic anymore, not even in private. The word that started circulating instead, quietly, almost reverently, was legend. She hated the word privately the same way she hated most language that turned a person into a symbol rather than letting them stay a person. Legends didn't get tired. Legends didn't lie awake some nights replaying the exact geometry of a low pass through a sandstorm, wondering how many degrees of error had separated success from catastrophe. Legends didn't sit alone in the quiet of an empty, ready room some evenings, running her thumb over the worn stitching of her callsign patch, thinking about all the pilots who had flown missions exactly as dangerous as hers and never survived to have anyone call them anything at all. But she also understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had carried her through 2 decades of a career that had never once been handed to her, that the word served a purpose bigger than her own discomfort with it. Every young pilot who heard the story of the Sandstorm mission, every mechanic who repeated the details of the Ironwood engagement in the maintenance hangar, every officer who now specifically requested her airframe by callsign rather than treating it as an interchangeable tasking, all of them were absorbing a lesson that had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with what the Air Force had almost thrown away out of fashion and impatience. The lesson was simple, and it was the same lesson her father had tried to teach her at the edge of a wheat field decades earlier. Usefulness doesn't announce itself in the language people expect it to. It doesn't always look fast or sleek or modern. Sometimes it looks like an ugly, slow, heavily armored airplane that nobody wanted to be photographed standing next to. Sometimes it looks like a pilot who spent years being underestimated by men who mistook their own comfort with certainty for actual expertise. Sometimes the thing that saves everyone is exactly the thing everyone had already decided wasn't worth saving. Colonel Briggs found her one evening on the flight line, several weeks after the Sandstorm mission, standing beside her aircraft as ground crew finished the day's maintenance checks. He approached the way men like him approach conversations they've been avoiding, sideways, with false casualness, as though he'd simply happened to be walking past rather than deliberately seeking her out. He stood for a moment looking at the aircraft, at the nose art, at the small collection of mission markings that had accumulated beneath the cockpit over the past month like a quiet ledger of everything the airframe had proven since the morning he'd called it a relic. "I was wrong," he said finally, without preamble, without the kind of elaborate apology that would have let him off the hook more comfortably. Just those 3 words, plain and unadorned, offered the way men like him rarely offered anything. "About the aircraft, about you." She let the silence sit for a moment before answering, not out of cruelty, but because some admissions deserve to be held rather than immediately smoothed over. "The aircraft never needed you to be right about it," she said finally. "It just needed the chance to prove what it always was." He nodded slowly, and something in his posture, the crossed arms, the set jaw, the certainty that had defined him since she'd first met him, had softened into something closer to a man still learning, at an age when most men had stopped expecting to. "There's a procurement review coming up," he said, changing the subject the way officers often did when emotion threatened to linger longer than rank was comfortable with. Congress is talking retirement again, phasing the whole airframe out in favor of multi-role platforms. Same argument they've been having for 15 years. He paused, glancing at the aircraft's worn skin, the dents and patched panels that told the story of every mission it had survived. I used to think that argument was obviously correct. I'm not as sure anymore. She had heard this argument her entire career, the slow grinding drumbeat of budget committees and defense contractors convinced that newer meant better, that a jet capable of doing everything adequately was preferable to one capable of doing one thing extraordinarily well. She understood the appeal of that logic in the abstract, understood the pressures of modern warfare that increasingly rewarded speed and stealth and networked sensors over the blunt, patient violence of a low-altitude cannon run. But she also understood something the budget committees rarely seemed to grasp from behind their desks, that somewhere always, there would be a wolfhound pinned down in a wadi with a critically wounded soldier and 20 minutes standing between them and a medevac that couldn't come fast enough. And in that moment, no amount of speed or stealth would matter as much as an aircraft that could simply stay low and slow and stubborn until the job was finished. They'll retire her eventually, she said, not bitterly, just honestly, the way she said most things. Everything gets retired eventually. That's not really the question that matters. What's the question that matters? Whether the people making that decision remember why she mattered in the first place once she's gone. Whether the next generation of pilots gets to learn the lesson I learned, or whether they just inherit the fashion instead, the assumption that fast and modern is always better, without ever having to find out the hard way that it isn't, not always, not for every kind of fight. She looked at him directly then, the closest thing to a real conversation they'd had since the morning he'd called her aircraft a museum piece. You called her outdated because nobody had shown you otherwise yet. That's not really your fault. But somebody's got to keep showing people, generation after generation, or the lesson dies with whoever learned it the hard way. Briggs didn't have an answer for that, not immediately, and she didn't expect one. Some lessons take longer to land than a single conversation on a flight line at dusk. But she noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he stopped making the joke about relics in briefing rooms. She noticed that when younger pilots repeated the old dismissive line about the airframe being obsolete, he was the one who corrected them now, with the specific authority of a man who had watched his own certainty get dismantled in real time and had chosen, difficult as it was, to let it stay dismantled rather than quietly rebuild it out of pride. It wasn't redemption exactly. It was something smaller and more honest than that, a man admitting he'd been wrong and choosing, deliberately, to keep being right about it going forward. The final mission of that deployment came almost as an afterthought. The kind of tasking that arrives at the end of a long rotation when everyone is already thinking about home rather than the war they're still technically fighting. A small forward outpost near the border, undermanned and overextended, had been requesting reinforcement for days while higher command debated whether the position was worth holding at all. The debate ended abruptly one morning when the outpost radioed in contact, not the scattered harassment fire they'd grown used to, but a coordinated assault clearly timed to catch them at their most exhausted, most depleted, most forgotten. Vesper took the tasking without hesitation, though something in her chest recognized the particular symmetry of it. One more isolated position, one more radio call full of fear, one more chance to be exactly the thing that showed up when everything else had failed to. Her wingman had rotated home the week before, replaced by a young lieutenant flying his first real combat tasking, nervous in the particular way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of herself at that age, sitting in briefing rooms and wondering if she'd ever be trusted with anything that mattered. Stay on my wing, don't overthink it, and remember the terrain is talking to you the whole time if you listen, she told him before takeoff, the same advice her own instructors had never quite managed to give her. Advice she'd had to learn instead through a decade of small mistakes and slow corrections. He nodded, jaw tight, and she recognized in that nod the specific mixture of terror and determination that every good pilot carries into their first real fight. The outpost when they arrived overhead was smaller and more exposed than she'd expected from the briefing photos, a scattering of hardened positions on a low rise, surrounded on three sides by terrain that gave the attacking force every advantage the defenders lacked. She could see muzzle flashes stitching across the perimeter even before she'd finished her first orbit, could hear in the radio traffic the particular fraying calm of soldiers who had been fighting long enough to be tired, but not so long they'd stopped caring about the outcome. Vesper 1-1, this is Outpost Cairn. We are danger close on all sides. I say again, we are surrounded. Request immediate suppression on the eastern approach. She didn't hesitate. She rolled the aircraft into the same low, deliberate dive that had become, over the course of this deployment, less a maneuver and more a signature. And behind her the young lieutenant followed, matching her angle, matching her discipline, learning in real time the lesson she had spent 20 years internalizing, that courage in the seat wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to stay anyway, orbit after orbit, pass after pass, for as long as the people on the ground needed you to. The gun spoke and spoke again, and somewhere below, an entrenched attack that had been built to overwhelm an undermanned outpost began, slowly and then all at once, to come apart against a resistance nobody down there had accounted for arriving from directly overhead. The fight for Cairn lasted longer than Ironwood had, dragging through the better part of 2 hours as the attacking force, more disciplined than expected, adapted and repositioned, and tried again from a new angle each time she and her wingman closed one avenue of approach. She burned through ammunition faster than she liked, made 2 separate trips back to a forward refueling point that had scrambled to accommodate a mission nobody had planned for that morning, and each time she lifted off again to return to the fight, the outpost radio traffic grew a little steadier, a little more grateful, the fraying calm of exhausted soldiers slowly replaced by something that resembled actual hope. Her young wingman held his own better than she'd expected, flying his first combat mission with a discipline that told her the terrain really had started talking to him, exactly as she'd promised it would. At one point, midway through the engagement, he identified a flanking maneuver on the outpost's western perimeter before she did, calling it out with a steadiness that surprised them both, and she felt something quietly proud settle in her chest, the specific satisfaction of watching a lesson take root in someone who would someday pass it along to somebody else in turn. "Nice eyes, Lieutenant," she said, banking to support his call. "That's exactly it. Keep watching like that." By the time the attacking force finally broke and withdrew, scattering back into the terrain they'd emerged from 2 hours earlier, the outpost had taken casualties but held, and every soldier inside its perimeter understood with total clarity what had made the difference between holding and falling. Outpost Cairn's commander, a weathered captain who had been fighting this war far longer than most, came on the radio himself as the fight wound down, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that sounded almost like disbelief that they'd actually survived. "Vesper, this is Cairn Actual. I've been in this theater 4 years. I have never—" He stopped, seemed to search for the words, then abandoned the search and simply said what was true. "I have never watched anything hold the sky like that, not once. Thank you doesn't cover it, but it's what I've got." She thought, hearing that, of Briggs standing on the flight line weeks earlier, of the morning she'd sat in the back of that briefing room absorbing his dismissal in silence, because she'd learned long ago it wasn't worth the fight. She thought of every mission before Ironwood that nobody had ever thanked her for this specifically. Missions flown with the exact same discipline and skill that had just saved an entire outpost. Missions that had simply happened without anyone watching closely enough to notice what they'd witnessed. "Just doing the job the aircraft was built for," she said, and meant it completely without false modesty, because that had always been the entire point, not glory, not vindication, just an airframe built for exactly this kind of fight, flown by someone who had never stopped believing in what it could do, long after everyone else had decided it wasn't worth believing in anymore. The deployment ended 3 weeks later, the way deployments always end, not with a single dramatic moment but with a slow accumulation of small administrative closures, gear packed into crates, aircraft prepped for the long transport home, soldiers saying goodbye to a place they'd never wanted to know as well as they now did. Vesper's final flight in theater was almost aggressively ordinary, a routine patrol over quiet terrain that offered no contact, no radio calls full of fear, nothing but empty sky and the steady hum of an engine that had carried her through more history than most people would ever know existed. She found to her own mild surprise that she missed the ordinary missions least of all. What she carried home instead was smaller and stranger, the memory of Wolfhound Six's voice cracking with relief over the radio, the sound of Osai's rag squeaking against the aircraft's skin as he counted battle damage with something like affection, the particular silence of Briggs standing at the flight line finally admitting what his pride had refused to admit for weeks. These were the things that stayed. Not the medals, though there would eventually be one. Not the mentions and reports, though those would come too, dry and clinical and utterly inadequate to what had actually happened in that valley. What stayed was the accumulated weight of every soldier who had looked up into a sky full of fear and found, instead of abandonment, a familiar shape circling patiently overhead, unwilling to leave until the job was finished. The squadron held a small, informal gathering the night before the transport flight home, the kind of gathering that exists in every deployment's final days, half celebration and half quiet grief for a chapter closing. Osai gave a short, gruff toast that made half the room laugh and the other half go misty-eyed. Something about aircraft and pilots who refused to know their own limits, delivered with the specific deadpan humor of a man who had spent 2 decades keeping broken machines flying and had learned, along the way, to love them the way other people love difficult, stubborn family members. Briggs was there too, standing near the back the way he had at the debrief weeks earlier, and when he raised his own glass, briefly quietly in her direction across the room, she understood it for what it was: not a grand gesture, not the kind of dramatic reconciliation a movie would have staged. Just a small, honest acknowledgement between two people who had started the deployment on opposite sides of a disagreement, and ended it unexpectedly, closer to the same understanding. She would fly home the next morning in the same aircraft that had carried her through Ironwood, through the sandstorm, through Cairn, its skin bearing the accumulated marks of everything it had survived, and somewhere in that long transit across an ocean and half a continent, she would have time to think about what all of it had actually meant, not just for her, but for every pilot who would come after her, inheriting an airframe and a lesson she had spent a career fighting to keep alive. Years later, long after Renata Kessler had traded active deployments for a training command, she would stand in front of briefing rooms not unlike the one where Briggs had once called her aircraft a museum piece, except now she was the one at the front, and the pilots in the seats were young enough that the word obsolete had never occurred to them as an insult so much as a question worth actually examining. She told them about Ironwood, not as legend, not as the polished anecdote it had become in squadron lore, but as a plain sequence of decisions made under pressure by people doing their best with imperfect information, because that was the truth of it, and she had never believed young pilots were served well by myths dressed up as history. She told them about the 4 seconds of dead radio silence before the fight began, about the way fear sounds different from courage on an open channel, even though both can sound almost identical to someone who hasn't learned to listen for the difference yet. She told them about her father and the wheat field, about learning to read a landscape's lies before it could kill her, about the particular unglamorous discipline of staying in a fight not because it was thrilling, but because somebody below was counting on you not to leave. She told them too about Briggs, not to shame him because the man had spent the years since genuinely trying to be better, had in fact become one of the loudest advocates for keeping the airframe flying once he understood what it was actually capable of, but because she wanted them to understand that changing your mind, publicly, humbly, in front of people who have every reason to resent you, is its own kind of courage, rarer than the kind that gets written about in mission reports. Her callsign patch still hung, faded and frayed, from a hook near her office door, Vesper stitched in the same black thread it had always worn, and new pilots who noticed it sometimes asked what it meant, expecting some elaborate story about evening skis or symbolic darkness. She usually told them the simple truth instead, that it meant the last light before full dark, the one star that stays visible after everything else has faded, the thing you can still count on when the day has otherwise given up. She let them decide for themselves whether that description fit the woman who'd earned it, or the aircraft she'd spent a career defending, or something larger than either one. The plain, stubborn idea that usefulness doesn't need to be fashionable to matter, that the sky doesn't care what anyone predicted about who would prove indispensable, and that somewhere in some valley nobody had bothered to name yet, there would always be a wolfhound waiting to find out who actually showed up when everything else failed. The A-10s kept flying long after the argument for retiring them should, by every fashionable metric, have finally won. Every time a procurement committee raised the question again, someone somewhere would tell the story of a valley called Ironwood, and a pilot everyone had once been foolish enough to underestimate, and the argument would lose a little more of its momentum. One more year, one more generation of pilots taught to look past what an aircraft looked like and ask instead what it had actually proven it could do. That, in the end, was the legacy that mattered most, not a medal, not a callsign, not even the woman herself, but the simple, hard-won truth that the sky remembers exactly who stayed, long after everyone else has forgotten who doubted.